Right, let's jump straight into this explainer and look at a seriously fascinating piece of history. We're going to break down exactly how Canadian forces completely locked down the skies over Normandy during World War II. When we picture D-Day and the Battle of Normandy, our minds immediately go to the grueling fight on the beaches and in those infamous hedgerows. But right above that battlefield, a completely different, incredibly calculated operation was unfolding. We're going to explore how ordinary soldiers and engineers built a deadly interconnected anti-aircraft system that fundamentally changed the course of the ground war. Get this, on the very morning of D-Day, two German Focke-Wulf 190s screamed across Juno Beach, right at rooftop height, guns blazing, and both pilots returned home without a single scratch, literally untouched. So, as far as the Luftwaffe knew on June 6th, the sky over the Canadian sector was just an empty, undefended highway. But what that exact same airspace became just weeks later, well, that's the core of our story today. So, what changed? Because by July, Luftwaffe pilots had a very specific phrase for the Canadian sector. They didn't call it a battle anymore. They called it a trap. To understand why survival rates for the German Air Force dropped to functionally zero in the specific area, we have to uncover the mystery of the trap that was waiting for them. It wasn't just luck, and it definitely wasn't just having more planes. It was a masterpiece of lethal engineering. To understand how this all worked, we need to dissect the system from the ground up. We'll start with number 1, the deadliest sky. 2, Layer 1, ground guns. 3, Layer 2, 90-second fighters. 4, Layer 3, night stalkers. And finally, 5, closing the fillets trap.
Okay, Section 1, the deadliest sky, anatomy of a trap. Now, by the spring of 1944, the German Air Force had indeed been blood white. But make no mistake, with roughly 800 combat aircraft still within striking distance of the Normandy beachhead, it was absolutely not dead. They were actively finding gaps over the American and British sectors to hit supply dumps and troop convoys. They were still incredibly dangerous.
To counter this massive threat, the Canadians built this 3-layer defense system, with the foundation laid in just 72 hours, and under incredibly hostile conditions, no less. It was basically a blueprint for a fully interconnected network. Ground guns, forward fighters, and night stalkers, all fed by a real-time radar and communications network. No German pilot had encountered anything remotely like this integration anywhere else in Normandy. The immediate impact of these defenses was just absolute. On the very first night, the Luftwaffe threw 217 bomber sorties at the beachhead in a desperate attempt to smash the invasion. 18 were completely destroyed. For a bomber force that was already hollowed out, losing 18 aircraft in a single night is an utterly unsustainable loss rate. It severely shocked the Luftwaffe and proved the beachhead was no longer an easy target.
Section 2, Layer 1, ground guns, featuring the 4th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment. This first layer relied entirely on the Royal Canadian Artillery, who landed their vehicles right onto Juno Beach on the late afternoon of D-Day. They drove through active shellfire, uncleared mines, and absolute chaos just to set up their equipment in the very fields the infantry had just fought for.
These gunners had trained for 3 long years in England for this exact moment. They memorized every single German aircraft silhouette. They operated these massive Bofors 40mm guns that could punch out 120 rounds per minute. At those ranges, they could unleash a literal curtain of high-explosive steel into the air that would reach an enemy plane in under 2 seconds. But what's absolutely staggering here is the sheer speed of it all. Barely 5 hours after hitting French soil, while the beach was literally still a graveyard of wrecked landing craft, the regiment secured their first kill, dropping a German Junkers 88 bomber right out of the dusk sky. That timeline proves this first layer of the trap wasn't just some theoretical plan. It was fully armed and lethal on day 1. Moving to Section 3, Layer 2, 90-second fighters, dirt airstrips to air dominance. Because, guns on the ground weren't enough to secure complete dominance. While the gunners watched the sky, Canadian engineers were aggressively carving forward dirt airstrips out of Norman cow pastures. Working through rain and enemy shellfire, they unrolled steel mesh tracking and created operational fighter bases in an astonishing 4 days. And this number right here, 90 seconds, this is the metric that absolutely terrified the Luftwaffe. Before these forward bases, a Spitfire flying from England took 30 minutes to cross the channel and reach the fight. But now, with airstrips practically right on the front lines, a flight of Canadian Spitfires could scramble and hit combat altitude over the enemy in just 90 seconds.
By shifting the supply line right to their front porch, the Allies totally changed the math of air warfare. The old system left these critical gaps because fighters burned so much fuel just commuting to the battlefield. But the new system meant 126 Wing could fly relentless, overlapping dawn-to-dusk patrols. They completely erased the gaps that German fighter bombers used to exploit, effectively shutting down daylight operations for the enemy.
Section 4. Layer 3. Night Stalkers, the mosquito threat. Since the daylight now completely belonged to the Spitfires and Typhoons, the Luftwaffe had no choice but to try their luck under the cover of night. And that brings us to the final and, honestly, perhaps most terrifying layer of the explainer, the Mosquito Night Fighters. This was the final nail in the coffin for German air operations over the Canadian sector. The Mosquito was just a marvel. It was this twin-engined, plywood-skinned aircraft that was impossibly fast. But its real secret weapon was its airborne radar. These Canadian and British crews didn't just aimlessly chase bombers in the dark. Guided by ground controllers reading live radar plots from the beach, they systematically stalked German planes in pitch-black conditions. Just put yourself in that cockpit for a second. Imagine the sheer tension of flying in total darkness, listening to your radar operator count down the meters, 200, 100, 60, until you are so incredibly close that you can literally see the exhaust glow of the enemy engine right in front of you. At 60 meters, the first burst of fire was almost always the last. The loss rates for the Germans climbed with terrifying speed. You see, the night bombing campaign wasn't ended by one dramatic, cinematic dogfight. It was ended purely by mathematics. When a squadron is losing 8, 10, or 12% of its aircraft every single night, a crew's statistical life expectancy drops to single-digit missions. By August, German night operations over the sector effectively ceased to exist. Section 5. Closing the Falaise Trap, the blinded enemy. With the sky completely sealed, day and night, we hit the climax of this whole explainer. This perfectly orchestrated air trap had a cascading and devastating effect on the actual ground war. Because the sky wasn't just a shield anymore, it became a massive tactical weapon. Because German aerial reconnaissance was totally blinded by this Canadian air umbrella, they literally had no idea what was coming. Every recon plane they sent up was swatted down. This allowed Allied commanders to secretly mass massive columns of armor right under the Germans' noses. Major operations were launched with complete surprise, eventually compressing 100,000 German soldiers into the Falaise pocket. The asymmetry here is just wild. The ground war simply wasn't a fair fight anymore. Canadian forces could take unrestricted photos and move freely in massive daylight convoys. Meanwhile, the German forces were completely blind, forced to move only at night in tiny groups. And the second the sun came up, their columns were ruthlessly strafed and paralyzed by Allied aircraft.
And here is the ultimate irony. The air trap was so successful that those Canadian anti-aircraft gunners actually found themselves with empty skies. So what did they do? They lowered the barrels of their massive Bofors guns and used them as mobile fire support to blast snipers out of hedgerows. And during that horrific, chaotic retreat of the German army through the Falaise Gap, not a single Luftwaffe fighter appeared to protect them. The trap was absolute.
But, as we look at this overwhelming tactical victory, it is absolutely crucial to remember the severe human toll. This system wasn't some magical technological miracle. It was built by ordinary gunners, engineers who worked through shellfire, and exhausted pilots. Squadrons suffered heavy casualties. Take 439 Squadron, losing 7 out of 27 pilots, more than 1 in 4. That is a staggering, heartbreaking price to pay for air supremacy. The entire essence of the operation really comes down to this. These guys didn't wake up wanting to create a perfectly optimized statistical trap for enemy aircraft. The sky was simply the tool they used. Protecting the lives of the infantry and the tank crews fighting in the mud below them, that was the entire point of this relentless, exhausting undertaking. The whole shebang. So when ordinary men build a flawless trap simply because they refuse to let the soldiers beside them fall, how does that devotion change the course of a war? It's a pretty profound thought to end on, right? It leaves you wondering just how many untold, brilliantly engineered operations exactly like this one are hidden away within the immense chaos of history, waiting to be explained. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I hope it completely changes the way you look at the skies over Normandy.